where we're going to start is just to talk a little bit about what autism is. And you've all probably seen, heard, come across information. Some of you have probably worked with folks who have autism and autism spectrum disorders. And a lot of the information surrounding it has changed over recent years. So let's talk about kind of how we think about autism now. We categorize autism as a pervasive developmental disorder. And that phrasing has important meaning to it. Pervasive really refers to a couple of components. When we talk about something being pervasive, what's important about what we're saying with that word is that this is a lifelong illness, typically, lifelong disorder, and it affects multiple aspects of life. When we say pervasive and we talk particularly about those multiple aspects of life, really what we're saying is that almost everything the person does is affected by the symptoms that go with this diagnosis. Something that's difficult to get away from. The developmental component really talks about where it begins and how it appears. And typically when we see autism, we can, if we see it when people are young, we can see that it's begun shortly after birth. Sometimes we detect it later in life, but a lot of times when we're doing our evaluations, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on, we find that parents, family members have been seeing things that are consistent with this for a long time, but didn't know what it was, didn't know why. It's there from a very early stage. And typically, to make a diagnosis, depending on which category we're talking about, we're going to have seen this sometime before 3 years of age. So it begins very early. And then, of course, disorder, as with anything, when we're talking about a mental health diagnosis, we're talking about something that impairs day-to-day functioning. So it's a pervasive developmental disorder. But that's not the only thing we need to know about it. It has some specific components that it refers to and that we see in terms of what happens with people. It is characterized by three primary areas that occur to some degree or another for virtually everybody who struggles with the disorder. The first is significant challenges with respect to social skills and social relationships. This is something that we see particularly for folks in schools, kids struggling with how to get along, how to understand other people and what they're doing, but it also follows folks into adult life and can cause significant difficulties in the workplace, in family, social relationships, and so on. We also see significant difficulties and differences in communication skills. Difficulties in that there are a large portion of people with autism who do not develop verbal skills at all. But for those who do, we often see significant differences in the way that they communicate, the way that they use their spoken language, where language is used less for relaying information and social contact between people and more for personal entertainment, sometimes to get wants and needs done and taken care of, although that's often a challenge area. Very significant differences here, and this is something that significantly impacts the way that their lives go. And then the third area that we see is stereotypical or ritualistic behavior. I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail. These can be unusual, make people seem different. They can also significantly interfere with the course of life because they will become far more important to the person than other things that the rest of us might hope that they're going to be engaged in. Another way that we think about this, and this comes up quite a bit of late, is autism is progressively more often being referred to as a spectrum disorder. A spectrum disorder is a condition where symptoms may be different in terms of the way that they're combined, how severe they are, or both from one person to the next. So we see folks who are mildly affected up to folks who are very severely affected. Spectrum disorders are coming up as a concept leading into the new diagnostic manual, but it's been something that we've been talking about for autism for some time, It is not identified as a spectrum disorder in the current diagnostic structure, but it is commonly discussed in this way with respect to day-to-day information, things that you will find when you do research on it. It's a very common way of thinking about it. Talking about it in the literature and in treatment information really is very similar to the way that we used to think about the word syndrome. You know, there's a collection of conditions. Not everybody has all of them, but when we see combinations of this collection, we think that it looks much like the same thing from one person to the next. When we talk about it being a spectrum disorder, right now, diagnostically, autism includes a variety of different diagnoses. These all fall under the category of pervasive developmental disorder in our current diagnostic structure. And within that spectrum, they all have those features to greater and lesser degrees. The communication issues, the social issues, and the difficulty with stereotypies. So there are multiple diagnoses. If you go into the DSM-4 TR, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, you'll find that autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, PDD-NOS or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Rett syndrome all appear there. You see, I've crossed Rett syndrome out. And the reason for that is because, unlike the rest of these, we've actually learned quite a bit since the DSM-4 was first published back in 1994. It's been a little while for the new version to come out. We've learned quite a bit about Rett syndrome. They've identified the genetic components to it. It's something that is distinct and different from the other items on here, although the presentation sometimes has symptoms that are similar to what we see here. But the clinical course is very different, the treatments are very different, and so what you'll see, particularly as we move into next diagnostic structures, is that that's not going to be included. And so as we talk today, I'm going to talk about these others. I'm going to leave that out, and that's why. It's turning out to be something different than the other things that we are going to be talking about. Where I'd like to start as we talk about the diagnostic component is to talk specifically about autistic disorder. The reason we're starting here in part is because when we talk about autism, and if you go into older literature about autism, when they refer to autism or people being autistic, what we'll be talking about here is really what they're talking about. This is what we think of as classic autism. And it has the three components described and broken down into very specific descriptions that help us understand what we're talking about when we talk about autistic disorder and autism in general. Once we're done with this particular section, I'll talk about the other diagnoses and talk about them against the backdrop of autistic disorder so that you have a clear idea of how they're different and what we see that is different. So this is the first section of the diagnostic criteria. People with autism have to have, with autistic disorder, to meet this diagnosis, have to have two of these items. They have to have poor nonverbal communication or absence of age-appropriate peer relationships, spontaneous attempts to engage socially, or lack of social or emotional reciprocity. These are what we consider qualitative impairments in social interaction. Now, poor nonverbal communication is something that it's important to understand in terms of what that looks like. So here we're not talking about the ability to speak at all, but just appropriate behavior when it comes to interacting with people nonverbally. This can be anything from making eye contact properly to positioning well in conversation and interaction. There are a multitude of mistakes that we can make here. If you work with somebody who has this disorder, you may find, for example, that when they approach you, they walk up and they start a conversation that looks something like this. Hello. No understanding that this is going to make you probably a little uncomfortable, right? Because they're not getting that there are specific rules that none of us ever explain to one another about how we interact nonverbally, right? If I'm talking with you and I'm having a conversation, I don't have to look you right in the eye, but I do need to look in your direction. I need to appear to be attending to you. If you're talking to me and I'm standing over here like this for our entire conversation, if I, for example, did this presentation standing and looking in this direction, I would be demonstrating quite poor nonverbal communication. Probably about 5 minutes into that, about half of you would leave, and for the next 15, the rest of you would go. I wouldn't notice because I'm looking in the corner, right? And that's one of the things that goes with these impairments in social interaction is a lot of times folks are not recognizing the effect of those difficulties in nonverbal interaction. Probably, if every time I talked to you I walked up and stood that distance, what's going to happen is as we start to see each other in the hall, you're going to see me at the far end of the hall and decide that you need to go into this room right now. Peek out and make sure that I'm not there before you come back out. I'm not going to recognize that. I'm also not going to recognize that you are uncomfortable when I'm doing these things. There's all sorts of mistakes that go with that, and it's important to realize that there's no rule book on what these things look like. We learn them from our parents, from our friends, the ways to behave in terms of nonverbal communication. Okay? Another important component I'm going to skip down here that goes with that is a lack of social or emotional reciprocity. This is the inability to understand how to give and take in terms of social interaction and emotional interaction. So not only am I doing poorly with nonverbal communication, but this is the thing that makes it difficult for me to understand that you're uncomfortable when I do the things that I do. Make sense? So I'm not doing this well, and I can't see that I'm making mistakes. You will see as well with this condition often an absence of what we call age-appropriate peer relationships. This happens up and down the ability scale, by which I mean I may be quite a bit lower functioning than my peers, and so be much more interested in my toys, in objects in the room, and just simply not engage with them at all. Or I can be functioning in a range that is very similar to where they're at, but simply not engage with them. Not be interested in it, or for some folks, this is actually a little bit more distressing when you're working with kids who have autism, I may not engage because I've failed so poorly in the past, and I can't understand what I'm doing wrong, that I just don't try anymore. So I'm over here in the corner reading my book on weather reports, page 493 at 8 years of age, over and over and over again, and I'd like to go talk to him, but every time I try to do that it goes badly and people yell at me and I don't know what I'm doing wrong and I can't figure out how to make it better. So I'm just not going to. So we need two of these to be present when we're working on a diagnosis of autistic disorder. The second area is specific qualitative impairments in communication. The previous criteria talks a little bit about nonverbal communication. This is more broad. Here we are talking about, often we see, and we just need to meet one of these, a delay in spoken language development, or a complete lack of spoken language development. Many people who meet the criteria for autistic disorder specifically have no spoken language. This is not uncommon. If they do have it, they may have delays in onset, or they may have unusual conversational styles when they're doing it. That's what these other items refer to. Okay? When speech is present, the person has difficulty initiating or maintaining conversation. Conversation is an important component there because what we're talking about here is I may be able to speak, but I don't talk to people. And a lot of the folks that I work with, what we see here is use of language for personal entertainment, enjoyment, or use of it in a ritualistic way where I'm talking about the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't matter if anybody's in the room. This is not for you, this is for me when I'm talking about these things. And so speech is present, but we're not using it conversationally. And if we do want to use it conversationally, as we talked about before, I may have a very poor idea of how to do that, so I simply don't. Similarly, and I kind of gave a blended example there, we see stereotype or repetitive language. The same phrases over and over again. done ritualistically, done in ways that are completely out of context with the meaning. So I might, for example, have heard a dish soap commercial on the TV, and the way the phrasing went in it with it really entertained me, and so now, as I'm on the playground in the afternoon with the other kids during recess, I'm repeating over and over again about how, what kind of dish soap do I use? You're soaking in it, right? Over and over and over again. I'm not really talking to anybody, and if somebody does come over and talk to me, this is what I'm going to say, so it's going to be a brief conversation. Then the other thing that is in the communication area, for reasons that I've never fully understood, but it is here, is just a lack of make-believe play or social imitative play, as appropriate to developmental level. So if you watch little kids on the playground, you're going to see that they do things together. I'm always amazed when I'm watching them, particularly as you get into the 5, 6, 7-year-old range, at how much of the time is spent talking about what the rules are. It's usually 5 minutes of play, and then we have to regroup again and talk about how the rules. No, I'm the mother in the house. You're the daughter, right? I can't be. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to say this, and we work this out, right? There's all of this work together where they're talking about the rules, but they're working on make-believe play or social imitative play, and this is where we're doing things together where we're pretending to be other things. Children pretending to be adults. Children pretending to be firemen and soldiers and cowboys and everything else. Those things are largely absent when we talk about this criteria. That falls under communication. We need to meet one of these. So we need to have an impairment in social interaction, an impairment in communication. We actually have to meet two of the criteria in social interaction, meet this one in communication. And then the third area is going to be ritualistic and stereotype patterns of interest. And this shows up in a broad variety of ways. The picture there is of a little guy. He's stacking cans. He's probably spending a lot of his time doing that. What we see here, in general, is a preoccupation with stereotype, or what we call restricted patterns of interest. Restricted patterns of interest means sometimes we're talking about things that could be viewed as being useful, but in fact, they're done in such a specific way and across so many different settings that it's out of context and not appropriate to what's going on. And that level of interest is abnormal. We talk about being abnormal in either intensity or focus. So, with respect to this, this can be talking about trains, for example, which for the folks that the higher functioning folks that I've worked with who have autism for some reason, this seems to be a very popular subject. Trains. I think trains are neat. I like to take the train into Chicago on occasion. I, however, can't tell you the name of the manufacturer's name of the cars that I'm sitting in. I can't tell you who laid the track that I'm riding on. I can't tell you which companies have owned it over the last 150 years, but I have worked with people who can, and they don't work for the railroad. And when I say, hey, how are you doing? The next step in the conversation is something like, did you realize that Amtrak just ordered a new batch of Pullmans? No, I didn't. And then we'll talk about that for quite a while. Intensive pattern of interest in a very narrow, restricted area. And that pattern of interest often, although that's not a part of this criteria, in terms of application, we often see that it is presented in a way that is oblivious to the listener's interests. Right? It's a very different thing, for example, for me to be up here talking with you folks about autism because nobody made you come. But if I talk about it with everybody I meet on the street, regardless of whether they've asked, we have a difference in presentation there. Okay? We will also sometimes see inflexible adherence to non-specific, non-functional routines or rituals. I've got rules about how things should be done, and they are inviolate. The world will be a much different place for you if you don't let me do this the way that I have in mind. And this can show up in a lot of different ways, and it's supposed to be non-functional. So, for example, if I have decided that all of the chairs at the end of the table need to be at right angles to the table, and nothing else is going to happen today until we get that done, that would probably be non-functional. And if I'm unable to give my presentation because some of you are sitting at an angle, it's really bothering me, and we're not going to move on until I can fix that. That would be an inflexible adherence. Kids often start to have difficulty. You'll see this here where come summer, the routine that went into preparing them for school and making sure they got out the door, well, that's done now. But it can be very stressful for them that we're no longer following those same rules. Yes?
Can you talk about how those routines are different in an autism or a spectrum disorder than they would be in like an OCD in a child?
That's a good question. And they may not be terribly different in terms of what they look like. Often the way that I think about, and there are absolutely people who think about them being almost identical. And so part of the difference there would simply be that we have these other components that go with it. Although in practice, when I'm looking at this, the primary difference I see when working with particularly higher functioning folks with autism, but also when doing behavioral work with lower functioning folks, even if they can't explain it, is that the person with OCD has to complete the rituals, and if they don't, the world will end, right? I mean, it's just, they're going to be horrible things. But they don't want to do the ritual. Whereas for the person with autism, the stress comes in not in doing the ritual, but that you are interfering with it. It's a fine distinction, but I think it's important in terms of how they look at it, because you're telling them that the ritual is crazy. If I need to arrange everything on my kitchen table at right angles before I can go on, because if I don't, I'm going to have an anxiety attack and I'm going to feel horrible like the world's going to end until that's fixed, and putting them in the right order is going to make that work. If I can explain to you that that's a little crazy, but I have to do it anyway, that's what OCD looks like. Whereas if I simply have rules that these things happen, it doesn't bother me that I'm not trying to avoid the anxiety that comes from not having it that way. I enjoy the ritual itself, and you being in the way of it is the problem. That's kind of the distinction. It's a very good question. Okay? And the other things that we see here, stereotyped and repetitive motor mannerisms. Folks, if you've worked with kids who have autism or adults, you've probably seen this, right? Here we have essentially movements that don't have a clear purpose to you or I, but the person does routinely. Again, you know, as best you can determine for their own entertainment. A lot of kids that I work with, if you watch them over a longer period of time, these often become worse when they're feeling stressed, although we don't know if that's specifically what it does. This can be anything from very basic things like finger looking. Work with a lot of kids who do this. You get the fingers waving. While they're doing things, you get kids that have to do and they get excited. You'll hear parents sometimes refer to it as shrieking and flapping. The noise level goes up, the arms go out. A lot of times you get things like toe walking that go with it. And it can become they can become very involved. I've worked with folks who do things that look more like tics, but don't meet the full criteria for a tic, any kind of a tic disorder. These are going to be movements. They can oftentimes take a lot of time. They will very much make folks look different from the kids around them. Yes?
You have mentioned several times this morning entertainment, and I'm wondering, is there anything about trying to establish a comfort, though, for that individual?
Well, that's kind of what I mean with that. I think that's in casual observation.
Okay.
In terms of the diagnostic criteria, we don't know, have any specific information as to why these things happen. It's just a description of what happens. And I think I mentioned a moment ago that What I see a lot of times with the stereotypies in particular is that they do seem to become more likely to happen during times of excitement or times of stress. So that if you make a sudden change in someone's schedule that they weren't expecting, now you get the person walking around, looking at fingers, doing these things, and often that takes a little while before it comes down and we can go on to the next thing.
Have they been able to identify some neurological, like are the synapses, or is there something physiologically that's going on at that point that's been understood?
I know people are looking at those things. We don't have answers to that. What you'll find, actually, those are very good questions, and what you'll find as we go through this is that there are a lot of these things that we've spent time looking at, but we don't know nearly as much about as we'd like. The last one on here is persistent preoccupation with parts of objects. It's kind of an odd description, but this is essentially regarding items for their component parts rather than for their use as a whole. It's the way to think about it. So you give a kid a toy truck, and what do they do with it? You gotta, huh? Take it apart. Okay. If they're not able to do that, what they will do a lot, you get on the floor, you start rolling around. You're interested, if it's a dump truck, you're going to put stuff in it and dump it out. However, what you might see with a child who has autistic disorder is instead of doing all of that, they may pick it up, look at the wheel, and spin it repeatedly, because that's the part of the truck they're interested in. None of that social imitative component is of any interest to them. In fact, they may know what a truck is. That just doesn't matter. What I'm interested in here is the wheel spinning. All right. We'll see if this works. In terms of repetitive restrictive interests, I have a video here, which hopefully will play properly. We'll see. Oh, we're hearing that, so that's a good sign. So here you go.
Okay, start again.
Trail responds to the radar indicator about the regardless. These storms are going to pass through very, very powerful winds, may 78 miles an hour. Next, just a weak tornado. And next week, if you live in Lane County, you need to begin to a safe place immediately. If you have a basement, the basement is the best place to go. Turn the television up as loud as you can. They'll talk you through the scene. You can't see a TV. It's 11:14 p.m. on Friday, May 30th, 2008. And we'll continue to talk you through the storm, what's going on. And then, and I want to show another product that we have for our radar system. Got a terminal destroyed temporarily. That's you just saw it disappear. What we're going to do is we're going to switch over to something else. Now this is the feature that we have here from Channel 7 with our radar system. And the car is looking at shows the pink and also red to see. It's the area that is seeing the shades of red. That's the area that says the turbulent winds are going to storm just to west of Cambridge City. And if there is going to be a tornado produced, that's where it could be. Now this is National Air Force radar in Wilmington. Take a look now. Now let's take a look at the winds from the National Air Force radar from India. Let's look from both sides. And you can see we're pretty much going to watch the same area from both radars. So go down.
Delightful young man. But he's a beautiful example as well, and he volunteered for that, by the way. He and his mother both. He's a beautiful example of somebody who engages in restrictive and repetitive areas of interest. Now he's quite bright, quite high functioning. His ability scores are above the average range. But he quite literally spends hours at home doing computer modeling for weather reports on his computer. He's 8 years old. He can tell you that weather report is from someplace in Indiana. He does not live in Indiana, right? And I don't know if you caught in there, but there are components of it where he's repeating it, that he's also talking about product reviews for the different weather stuff. He is repeating verbatim what he heard back in 2008 because it fascinates him. And the first 5 minutes of it fascinate his parents. And the rest of it gets very old very, very quickly. But this is what he does often in exclusion to other social activities. So he's not running around playing with other kids in the neighborhood. He's not doing those other things. This is what he's choosing to spend his time on. And then he also does have the other social issues as well. He has a difficult time making eye contact. He uses verbal communication fairly well in terms of transmitting information, but frequently makes statements and tells people things about themselves that, frankly, they'd rather not know. And does not see that he's making those mistakes or errors. So, just a nice example. Let's talk a little bit about then what things look like for where we start to see these things show up. So for autistic disorder, in addition to meeting those 3 criteria, there are a couple of other things that must happen. We have to have delays present in social, language, or symbolic play prior to 3 years of age. Now this doesn't mean that it has to be diagnosed prior to 3 years of age. But when we're going through and we're doing an assessment with a child, we have to be able to get information to tell us that it was, that the components of this were seen before that point. So a lot of times this is going to be gathered through an interview with parents, getting information in that respect. We need to be able to establish it prior to age 3 years. All right. There are other diagnoses within the DSM that fall under pervasive developmental disorders. The first one, and the one that probably folks have heard about most often, in addition to autism proper or autism spectrum disorder, is Asperger's disorder. And this is different from that classic autism in a couple of key components. Folks do have significant impairments in social interaction. We do see restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior and interests, but there are no delays in language development. And no delays in IQ or adaptive skills development. Adaptive skills development, particularly with respect to areas other than social skills. So, a lot of times what we'll see here, we have, in terms of key differences, when I say no delays in intellectual or adaptive skills development, what you see is that you cannot technically have a diagnosis of Asperger's disorder and have an IQ in the mental retardation range, for example. If we do a SIBR or an ICAP on an adult and they have adaptive skills that are below the average range, we can't give a diagnosis of Asperger's. Doesn't mean they don't have an autism spectrum diagnosis, they don't meet this specific diagnosis. The sort of classic description of Asperger's, often you would get people, children in particular, described as being little professors. So here are kids in school recognized as having very peculiar, very specific patterns of interest in focused subjects, and those impairments in social interaction particularly show up in that they're too interested in this to worry about social interaction, plus they can talk to you exhaustively about those interests. As adults, a lot of times people will think about specific people as likely having, you get those lists of famous people who may or may not have had this disorder or that disorder and so on. Sort of the classic person that shows up on here often, as described as having Asperger's disorder, is Bill Gates. I've never met Bill, I don't know if he has it. But very focused area of interest, not so much with the social skills. Now Bill has actually managed to get himself, ridiculously wealthy, so this hasn't been much of a disorder for him, if that's what's going on. A lot of times, I will find folks who meet these other criteria who are typically functioning, but we have troubles with giving this diagnosis because even with all of that going on and the rest of it looking like Asperger's, we find that they have delays in language development or delays in adaptive skills outside of just the social stuff. So for example, if I can't figure out how to adequately care for my home and I live in a mess because I don't really care what it looks like to other people and I'm too busy with all of these other primary focuses to do a good job of taking care of it, I may look a lot like a person with Asperger's disorder but not meet the diagnostic criteria. The next one on our list is childhood disintegrative disorder. This one is unusual for a number of different reasons. I think I have seen in 15 years of doing this work one person who met this diagnostic criteria, but it's in the manual. Here we have all of the social and communication and restricted areas of interest issues. At least 2 of those 3 areas have to be met. The key difference here is that there's apparently normal development for the first 2 years of life and then a regression. The aggression has to occur before 10 years of age. We have specific areas where it shows up. So if you've got somebody who seems to be going along for at least the first 2 years and then take a significant backslide in terms of adaptive ability, intellectual functioning, language skills, and so on, this may be the diagnosis that we're looking at, particularly if the rest of it looks like autistic disorder. Parents will talk a lot about having had normal development early on and then things go back. When we do real focus work on when things seem to have happened and where milestones are, we don't end up making this diagnosis often. This one actually won't be in the DSM-5. Yes?
Is that similar to Liebowitz-Becker disorder?
It's been a while since I've looked at the criteria for that. So I'm going to beg off answering that question. But there are definitely other disorders that do this. And it's important to bear in mind as we go through these that the DSM diagnostic criteria don't speak to cause. And a lot of times, over time, as we do our research and we investigate things more closely, what we find is that, as with Rett's disorder, as I talked about earlier, as we're researching them, we find explanations that really give us better options and better avenues of treatment than going this route. So yes, there may certainly be that we find things that better explain what we're seeing here and give us a better way to go. And then we have PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Essentially, you can think about this to some degree as being autism light in some respects. We're not meeting, we definitely have symptoms that are present among people who have autism. The symptoms are causing a significant level of distress, but we don't meet full criteria for any of the other disorders. So if you have somebody who has significant social issues, spends a lot of time engaged in stereotypies, but doesn't meet the full criteria, you believe that they need help, you believe that they ought to meet the diagnostic criteria, this may be where they go. I talked a little bit about the folks who look a lot like they have Asperger's but have an adaptive skill deficit, for example, where I can't categorize them as somebody with Asperger's disorder. This is usually where I end up categorizing them. It's also important to realize that there's not a lot of difference from one diagnosis to the next with respect to what we're going to recommend for treatment. The treatment profile for pretty much all of the autism spectrum disorders right now looks pretty similar. So being accurate here won't make a difference with respect to what folks are getting. I do know that different school districts feel differently about that, because I've certainly run into school districts where they're confused by a PDD-NOS diagnosis, but know exactly what to do if there's an autism diagnosis. So that may be a consideration as well. Something else I'll mention here, I probably made a lot of references, and I used Ed for an example for these diagnoses. These are disorders often first recognized in childhood. They don't go away into adulthood. So as you're going through and meeting people and starting to work with them for the first time, if they're in their teens, 20s, 30s, and so on, you certainly still can see these things. And we work with a lot of folks who are adults, often, from quite young to early adults, well deep into the age spectrum, who also meet these criteria. And the things that we'll be talking about with respect to assessment and treatment apply across the age range. In addition to the formal diagnostic criteria that we have for autism and other related disorders, there are a number of other conditions that often occur in conjunction with autism. So we're going to talk briefly about these things. These aren't diagnostic. We wouldn't use these to identify autism, but we often see them going along with it. A fairly relatively higher than the general population percentage of people with autism have epilepsy, seizure disorders. Particularly for people with autism disorder proper, intellectual disabilities are not uncommon. And earlier on, before the diagnoses were broadened, which we'll talk about, this was actually a very common feature of it. Some people, and you asked this question earlier, what's the difference between OCD and the stereotypic components? Well, some people do display stereotypical behaviors with autism that are similar enough to OCD that we'll actually see it diagnosed and categorized in that way. A lot of folks have higher than average energy levels. The young man that I showed you the video of, he's one of those. So not only is he talking about the weather all the time, but he talks about the weather a lot, very fast all the time. Right? Put a note here. One of the things, there are several diagnoses that having a diagnosis of autism rule out. So I put hyperactivity here instead of ADHD because technically you have an autistic disorder diagnosis. You don't diagnose ADHD, but you certainly can have hyperactivity as a part of it. A lot of folks have very short attention spans, which contradicts a little bit what we're talking about being intensely focused on things. And so the way to think about this is that they have a short attention span in particular for the things you'd like them to be interested in. Maybe not so much for the things they're intensively focused on. Often difficulties with impulsivity, so that if I am someone, for example, who very much likes a particular type of soda, and I see it on the table over there, I may run over and take it because it's there, and there's not a lot of filter between the thought and the action. Okay? Depression can be a common comorbid feature. In particular, my personal experience with this, my clinical experience, is with higher functioning kids who, as they get into early teenage and high school years, very much recognize the errors they're making in those social interactions, would like to have some friends like they see other people having, and start to have difficulty making that happen. Sensory sensitivities is, if you've worked in the field at all, something you've probably seen quite a bit of. This covers a variety of different areas. This can be things as simple as having sensitivity to specific types of clothing. I've worked with a lot of kids who mom has to remove every tag on the back of every shirt. Kids that can't do buttons that button up all the way to the top because the collar is really just way too restrictive. I've worked with kids who can only wear sweatpants because jeans and khakis just don't feel right and they can't handle them. Those are tactile sensitivities. Kids who have significant difficulty with noise levels above a certain volume. Work with kids that we put actually Hunter's earmuffs on them to help them get through school. Okay? Restricted dietary interests, I'll pull into this because I have worked with kids who will not eat food of a given texture. I have a colleague who has been working with a young man since he was 5 or 6 years old who would only eat things of a pudding consistency. Just couldn't manage anything else. Right? They managed to keep him alive and keep him going, and he's entered the military. I'm not sure how that's worked. If you have to eat everything on your plate, that may be a bit of a challenge. So all sorts of sensitivities here. These are not diagnostic, but they're very common. We see them quite a bit. Splinter skills. When we do formal testing, what we're talking about when we talk about splinter skills is specific areas of significantly stronger ability. The very classic term for this, people will sometimes refer to as savants. There's a gentleman who's been touring the country for the past 20 years who plays piano by ear, for example, has severe autism, has an intellectual disability as well, but if he's heard it, he can play it. We see other folks who have number skills. I work with a gentleman at one of the state-operated developmental centers who, if you tell him your date of birth, he can tell you what day of the week you were born on, seconds later, right? So we have these splinter skills, and we call them splinter skills because they're out there by themselves. They're splintered off and they're an unusual area of strength. They don't contribute necessarily to other areas. So he's extremely good at sorting out on the calendar when you were born, but he can't do his checkbook. It's very specific to the calendar and those components. Okay? Some folks have what we call poor motor planning. It's a very general way to say they can be a little clumsy, right? And a lot of folks that I have worked with and seen in other settings have differences in sleep presentation. They don't sleep at night. They also don't sleep during the day. They're not really manic because we don't have the other components that go with it, but they just need maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep and that's it. This can be extremely stressful for parents. Right? If you need a full 8 hours, as most of us do, and your little guy is up at 3 in the morning every night and you couldn't get him to bed until 11 every night, you know, the folks at work stop recognizing you because of the circles under your eyes. And usually when they're up, they're not just up sitting quietly. Right? They're up, they're active, they want to do the other stuff that they're doing during the day. Questions about any of these? Yes?
Do you see any anxiety when they become aware they're not fitting in?
Yeah, and and actually I should say that's a good question. There's probably a half dozen to a dozen more things we could put on here that we see and observe. So it's not an exhaustive list. We see depressive symptoms that go sometimes with the difficulties in social interaction. We definitely see things that look like anxiety, both for folks who have good verbal skills and can explain it to us, where they just they can't sit down, they can explain that, but also just in the behavioral actions of folks who cannot. That will show up in particular with the social components you're talking about. We'll see where we're going into new situations and not knowing what to expect. Often we'll get that kind of an expression. Yes?
2 questions. First of all, I was wondering about the co-occurring, like a brain disorder. You can have traumatic brain injury. I could see where there'd be a lot of overlap between someone who had a traumatic brain injury and if that he would still have a spectrum diagnosis. And then the other question was about bipolar disorder, because I see that diagnosed, especially in children, a lot. And I always struggle because I feel sometimes that it's hard to medicate when a child is hospitalized for severe emotional dysregulation or self-induced behavior. It's hard to, I know, as far as I know, we don't really medicate for a lot of spectrum disorders, but we can treat the mood instability. So a lot of these kids, I think, get unfairly slapped with bipolar disorder as well. So I probably
Ask the first part again.
About the traumatic brain injury.
Traumatic brain injury. Okay, well, there are some clinical decisions that would go with that. But I can say with respect to the diagnostic criteria that they are agnostic as to etiology. There's no indication of cause. So technically, if I meet all of the criteria of autistic disorder and I had a traumatic brain injury, I would meet the criteria. So the diagnosis could be given. Now, I say there's some clinical decisions there, because then you have to decide, is that the best, most accurate diagnosis for that person? A classic diagnosis of autistic disorder would probably be challenging unless the brain injury happened before 3 years of age. And I would be looking in that particular sort of case for whether we have other things going on that might make a diagnosis is useful to the degree that it directs and tells us what the appropriate treatment is. So, and we're going to talk later about what the appropriate, what some appropriate treatments are for autistic disorder. Part of that decision-making process would be, if I have somebody who has a TBI, are the treatments that we do for autism the things that they need? I'd also wonder, clinically, I'd want assessments done to make sure that those aren't expressions of something else, where if I've got severe areas of brain injury that simply make specific skill completion very difficult because the parts of the brain that do that are damaged, there may be other different types of rehabilitative treatments that would be more appropriate. So that's part of that clinical decision making. I don't think, and I would have to look, I don't think that autistic disorder is ruled out by rules out a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And I do see those things applied. I would step back to that same question. Clinically, the diagnosis should be used that affords the most appropriate treatment. So, if that diagnosis is going to get the person what they need in terms of the best treatment, that may be appropriate, assuming they also meet the criteria. But a lot of times what we'll see when we work with kids and adults, it's not uncommon for me, particularly for example at the state facilities, to have somebody come in, a 40-year-old adult who has diagnoses of, here, we'll see folks come in with a diagnosis of psychosis NOS and bipolar NOS and X, Y, and Z. A lot of times what we'll see is something, a combination like bipolar NOS and OCD, right? And pretty much at that point, if I get the paperwork ahead of time, I'm going to check this person out for autism when they come in the door. Because if I'm really energetic, really focused on specific things, and I have ritualistic behavior, it's a good chance that we have folks in the community who aren't very familiar with autism, who didn't recognize it. They're trying their level best to help family or the local facility address it, and we may have something different going on, and that's probably why they're coming in the door. Make sense? Other questions about this?